But I remember as the regional head of the NAACP back in the late 50s and 1960s, early 1960s, Brooklyn, and I grew up in central Brooklyn, I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I remember some of the ministers in central Brooklyn, great names like Gardner Taylor and William Augustus Jones over at Bethany Baptist Church and Milton Galamison. I remember the ministers then being arrested for things like, at that point, the A&P on Utica Avenue, where you could shop, but you couldn't get a job if you were African American. I remember them sitting down in front of the bulldozers as the new Boys and Girls High School on Fulton Street was being built, where there wasn't an African American on the job site. And they used to go and get arrested. My father used to go and bail them out. As a matter of fact, we kid around. Somebody that he used to bail out, a boy preacher named Al Sharpton. Back then, Al and I have been friends for years. And he jokes about how, yeah, you know, your dad came and got me out of jail when I was like 14 years old. But that was Brooklyn in the 1950s and 60s. And it didn't just end then. So it wasn't just, if you look back at the time, it wasn't just discrimination in the South. It was discrimination in the North, discrimination in New York City. So before, as I said, and one of the things we always need to be aware of, you have to take stock of where you came from and what was overcome and what the situation was like, not just in the South, but in the North also. Dr. King was aware of that and talked about it in his comments also. Not to overlook, not to ignore, not to just think it was an issue that was central to the South. It was a widespread, and still, I don't think we've fully overcome. You know, as I said, we've seen a lot over the years, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. You've seen change. This country has changed dramatically over the years. You know, I never thought, and it was funny, I got to do a television interview after Barack Obama became president of the United States. During that run, during his run for president, there were things that my father talked about I had never heard him speak about. He talked about he's a World War II veteran. He talked about coming back through Washington, D.C. after the war. Had been wounded, Purple Heart, but the German prisoners of war were being fed in the mess hall, in the nation's capital. But at the same point, the black soldiers who had just fought for their country had to go into a colored-only mess hall down the way. Couldn't eat in the same place that the regular soldiers ate. So much has changed over the years, and all of a sudden, as I said, we got to an election that my father knew he'd never see. I never thought I'd see an African-American president. We did a 3-generation interview on New York One. My daughter, who's 31 years old and a New York City public school teacher, was the third person on the show and said she never thought that she'd see that in her lifetime. And that kind of threw me off also, because it was the level of expectation even for somebody who had decades to go. She never thought she'd see it. Well, that was a huge moment in this country's history. Someone had said, well, you know, if Dr. King were alive today, upon the election of Barack Obama, he would have been satisfied. I think many of us have heard the comments afterwards about, I think the phrase was post-racial era, that race no longer mattered and everything was fair and equal. Well, I don't think that the dream has been realized. I don't think we've hit that fully post-racial era. Have things changed? Yes, they have. Have things changed dramatically in so many ways? Heck, looking around, your employees at the Port Authority. Years ago, would this room have looked like this? Absolutely not. And I think we all understand that. If we would have gone back 20 years, this would have been a very different looking room if we were talking about employees of the Port Authority. But at the same point, as we look at the true realization of Dr. King's dream, as we now, as part of your theme, look forward, what really would help to be the full realization of his dream? Economic equality. I think, as you start to look in the comptroller's office, as comptroller of the city of New York for almost 8 years, we look and broke down numbers and analyze those numbers. You look at unemployment numbers. You look at foreclosure numbers. So as New York City and the rest of the country fell into recession in the last 3 years, you looked at a larger impact on communities of color in New York City than other communities. You looked at the rise of foreclosures and where those foreclosures impacted people. Central Brooklyn, Southeast Queens, parts of the Bronx. You understood that they were being disproportionately affected compared to other communities. Post-racial, we haven't fully gotten there yet. You look as we went into recession, unemployment numbers. Unemployment in New York City at one point, and it was something that when the president was in town I just done a report. He was in town at the NAACP convention in its 100th year and mentioned then that the numbers were frightening, that the unemployment numbers for African American men, and this is in 2009, was close to 18%. The rest of the city, about 9%. And it grew a bit, but for African American men, it was about 18%. And what 18% really means, documented, we all know it's probably about double. So you were sitting there saying, my God, probably the real number was in excess of 30%. So we start to look at, and I was on a radio show the other day with Mayor David Dinkins. He was kind of looking back. I was on with David Jones, the head of the Community Service Society. The Community Service Society has documented well over the years the economic disparities in New York City and highlighted it. Now, I'm not talking about Alabama or Mississippi. It's New York City, and it's the year 2011. And we still have disparities. We still have the employment gap. We still have excess unemployment. We still have groups of young people between the age of 16 and 24 who are in crisis. And the faces of those young people are heavily African American. We still look at a need, if we're going to talk about realizing Dr. King's dream and fully realizing it, we need to talk about economic equality also. So are we done? No, we're not done. Dr. King also highlighted and spoke about educational equality. We still look at our public schools. And look, I've been a critic of when Joel Klein was there as chancellor, because I said then I thought the numbers were inflated. I thought that the talk about massive success, was there change in gain? Yes. But New York City having massive success as if there were no problems still in our education system. Well, after the renorming last year of scores, all of the gains and so much of the closing of the gap that had been spoken about between students of color and their white counterparts evaporated. And I think we understood now, wait a minute. We still have, when it comes to educational gain, when it comes to providing real educational opportunity to our young people, we still have a long way to go. So no, Dr. King's dream, the full realization of the dream, as we look forward, it is economic equality, it is educational equality. If back in the 60s and 70s it was about changing institutions and changing laws, now it's about changing minds and looking and making real change and substantive, substantial change that will have lasting and lifelong impact. It is about jobs, it's about education, it's making sure that the opportunities for young people today are better than they've ever been before. And that's what we have to work to do. That's the direction that we have to go in. You know, One last point, and I'm not even going to get back into it as we talk about the graduation gap, number of students in colleges. We have a long way to go. We have a long, long way to go. One last point, and I mentioned it before, and there are a number of people in this room over the age of 21. Our young people, not just African American young people, our young men and women who are African American, who are Hispanic, who are Asian, who are white, have no sense of history and where New York City was, or where this country was in the 40s. I'm not talking about in slavery times, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and how much has changed. The images that they see today, in so many ways, are distorted images, and images without history behind them. And many of you in this room have been involved in changing history, even if it's on a daily basis in the jobs that you're involved in. Talk to our young people. Let them understand where this country has come from, because then it starts to let them understand still how far we have to go. And it lets them understand that what they have been given, so many others worked to achieve. Not just gave their lives, but had the dream deferred, had opportunities denied, weren't able to realize their full potential. And why it is so incumbent upon them to seize the opportunity that they have been given and to try and do more than was done before. That they have an obligation to build a better future, not just to sit back and accept what they've been given. And I hear it all too often, as I said, you talk about Dr. King. To so many of our young people these days, Dr. King's a holiday. It's a day they don't have to go to school. And they don't have they can give you a little bit of the quotes, but they can't tell you what it means. Because that level of history hasn't been taught them. And not just in schools, but by family and friends. So I always, it's one of the things that concerns me. The longer and further along the time moves, the less our young people understand. Teach them. Let them understand what their history has been. As a nation, all children, because they'll have a greater appreciation of where we have to go and looking at the future. So again, to those of you at the Port Authority, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Let me thank all of you for the jobs that you do. The one thing that people, and too many don't understand, they look at authorities, they look at government and kind of lump it together and don't understand that if you don't do the jobs that you do each and every day, this city, this state, New York, New Jersey, don't move. And as a matter of fact, in so many ways, this country stops because we are a hub in so many different ways. Let me thank you for the jobs that you do. Let me thank you for what you do for this, I will say my state, even though it's always a tri-state area. But one last comment from that same speech, to give you an idea that Dr. King, it was about economic opportunity and how back in 1963, we could have taken and moved him and put him in 2011 and the comments would still be very appropriate. In that same speech from Detroit, and I talked about the I Have a Dream speech. If you go back and look at this, there's so much of the I have a dream in this. And there's a number of quotes about I have a dream, I have a dream. But one of them, I have a dream this afternoon that one day right here in Detroit, Negroes will be able to buy a house or rent a house anywhere, that their money will carry them and they'll be able to get a job. Back then, in 1963, Dr. King saw the future. It wasn't just about being able to sit at a lunch counter or to be able to have accommodations, be able to rent a hotel room. It was about having the money and the job to be able to do that. And that's where we're at today. That we need to look and still work hard to make change in those areas so that this is a society that treats each and every person as equals. Again, thank you for allowing me to speak to you this morning. Look forward to seeing everybody in the future. Thank you so much.